The rain poured endlessly that morning, turning the narrow streets into rivers of silver. Lila Morris tightened her worn coat and clutched her resume close to her chest. She was late again. The address on the crumpled paper led her to the edge of town, where an old mansion stood behind iron gates and creeping vines. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a memory that refused to fade. She rang the bell twice before the heavy door creaked open. A small, serious woman with gray hair and sharp eyes appeared. "Can I help you?" I'm here for the caregiver position," Lila said, forcing a smile. The woman looked her over. "Most applicants don't come back after seeing the place." "I'm not most applicants," Lila replied softly. The woman nodded, motioning her in. "I'm Mrs. Halvorson, the housekeeper. You'll be taking care of Mr. Grant." Lila glanced around. Dust floated in the light from tall windows. The air smelled of old books and solitude. Then, from upstairs, came the sound of a cane tapping on the floor. Mr. Henry Grant was not what Lila expected. He sat in a large leather chair, wrapped in a thick blanket, eyes as cold as winter. His voice was dry and sharp. "You're the new one?" "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. I'm not a general. I'm just an old man waiting for boredom to finish me off." Lila bit her tongue. "Would you like me to start by?" "I'd like you to start by leaving me alone." She took a deep breath. Most people would have walked out right then. But she thought of her mother, lying in a small hospital bed, waiting for her next treatment. She couldn't afford to quit. "Dinner will be ready at 7, she said, quietly turning toward the door. As she left, Henry muttered under his breath, "Another one who'll last a week." But that night, when he came down for dinner, he found something different. A steaming bowl of soup that smelled like home, and a small vase of fresh wildflowers beside his plate. He didn't say a word, but when Lila left the room, he picked up one of the flowers and smiled faintly. For the first time in years, days turned into weeks. Lila cleaned, cooked, and read aloud from old novels every evening, even when Henry pretended not to listen. Sometimes, she caught him glancing at her reflection in the window as she read, his expression softening for just a second before turning cold again. One night, during a storm, the power went out. Lila found Henry sitting alone in the dark. "Mr. Grant?" she asked, holding a candle. He looked up. "You're not afraid of the dark?" "No. The dark's just what you see when the light rests." Something flickered in his eyes. A memory, perhaps. "You speak like someone who's known too much of it," he murmured. "I suppose I have," she replied. The next morning, when she entered the study, she found a small note on the desk. It read simply, "The roses in the garden need trimming. I used to take care of them myself." No signature, just his quiet way of saying, "Thank you for staying." It had been 2 months since Lila first stepped into the Grant mansion. What once felt like a prison of silence was slowly becoming alive. The scent of bread baking in the kitchen, the hum of her soft singing as she cleaned. Even Henry's cane tapping through the hallways sounded less harsh, more like rhythm than irritation. That morning, she took his note seriously. She found the rose garden, or what was left of it, behind the mansion. Weeds had conquered the soil, and the bushes were overgrown. Henry watched her from the window as she knelt in the dirt, cutting away the thorns. Later, when she entered the study, his voice broke the silence. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, smiling. "But they were suffocating." He paused. "So were you." Their eyes met, two souls who had forgotten what warmth felt like. One afternoon, as Lila dusted the long hallway upstairs, she noticed something odd. A small door at the far end, half hidden behind an old curtain. It was locked, but there was something about it. The way the wood was polished, the faint scent of cigar smoke that lingered near it. She asked Mrs. Halvorson later, "What's behind that door?" The older woman stiffened. "That room's been locked for over 15 years. Don't ask about it." "Why?" "Because Mr. Grant doesn't open old wounds." That night, Lila couldn't sleep. The sound of rain against the window, the echo of that locked door in her mind. It felt like the mansion was whispering secrets. She didn't know it yet, but she had just tugged at the first thread of a truth that would unravel everything. A week later, Henry fell asleep in his armchair as Lila read to him. The book slipped from his hand, and when she bent to pick it up, an old photograph fell from between the pages. It showed a much younger Henry, smiling, handsome, standing beside a woman and a little boy. On the back were the words, "For every empire, there's a heart that built it." Lila froze. That night she went back to the hallway. The door seemed to call her name. She knelt beside it and noticed something. The lock was old, fragile, almost as if it wanted to be opened. Before she could act, Henry's voice echoed down the hall. "Some doors, Miss Morris, should stay closed." She turned. He was standing at the other end of the corridor, his cane trembling slightly. His eyes weren't angry, they were pleading. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once and walked away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he wanted her to know. The next morning, Mrs. Halvorson sat across from Lila at breakfast, unusually quiet. After a long silence, she said softly, "He wasn't always like this, you know? Mr. Grant." She nodded. "He was brilliant, kind, a visionary. He built companies, helped people, until tragedy took it all." "What tragedy?" Lila asked. Mrs. Halvorson's eyes filled with something that looked like sorrow or guilt. "His son and daughter-in-law died in an accident 15 years ago. Mr. Grant shut down everything afterward. Sold his companies, disappeared from the world. Only his grandson knows where he is, and even he doesn't visit." Lila's heart sank. The photograph, the locked door, the silence, it all made sense. That evening, as she served him tea, she quietly placed the photograph on the table beside him. "I'm sorry I found it," she said, "but I think you miss them every day." He didn't reply, but for the first time, she saw tears glisten in Henry's cold, distant eyes. And in that moment, something shifted. A wall, 15 years thick, began to crack. Lila woke early the next morning to the sound of music. Faint, elegant piano notes drifting from the living room. She froze. Henry never allowed anyone to touch the grand piano that stood there, covered in dust and silence. But now, he was sitting before it, his fingers trembling slightly over the keys, playing a haunting melody that spoke of love and loss. When he noticed her in the doorway, he stopped abruptly. "I used to play for my wife," he said, voice low. "She used to say my music could make the sun rise faster." Lila smiled softly. "It still can." For a moment, he looked like a different man. Not a bitter old recluse, but someone who had once carried the world on his shoulders. Then he sighed, looking at the piano. "I thought money could fix grief. I learned too late that it only builds higher walls." Lila frowned. "Money?" He glanced at her, realizing what he had just revealed. "Nothing," he muttered, standing. "Forget I said that." But Lila couldn't forget. The words "money could fix grief" echoed in her mind all night. A week later, Mrs. Halvorson had to leave the mansion for a few days to visit her sister. Henry was asleep, and the house was wrapped in quiet shadows. Lila stood once more before the locked door. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. She hesitated only a moment before turning the old key she'd found earlier in a desk drawer. The lock clicked. Inside was a time capsule. Photos covered the walls. Henry smiling with his wife, his son, and a boy with bright green eyes. Awards, framed newspaper articles, and business documents filled the room. One newspaper headline caught her eye. "Henry Grant, the billionaire who vanished." Her hands trembled as she read. Henry Grant, billionaire philanthropist, founder of Grant Enterprises. A man who disappeared after his family's death, leaving behind a fortune and a mystery. Lila sank into the armchair, her mind spinning. The man she'd been caring for wasn't just lonely, he was legendary, and he'd chosen to live as a ghost. That evening, when Henry came downstairs, Lila stood waiting for him in the study. "I know who you are," she said quietly. He froze. His eyes, once sharp, now looked tired. "I didn't mean to pry, but I found the room. I saw everything." After a long silence, he said softly, And now you'll leave like the others. Lila shook her head. No, because now I understand you. He looked at her, confused. You lost everything, not just your family, but your reason to keep living. You wanted to see if kindness still existed, even when there was nothing to gain from it. Henry's voice cracked. And what did you find, Miss Morris? She smiled sadly. I found a man who forgot that his heart is still alive. Tears filled his eyes. For years he had lived unseen, unloved, unremembered. And now, this young woman had peeled away his loneliness with nothing but compassion. You're a strange girl, he whispered. Maybe, she replied softly. But you're a good man, Mr. Grant. The next week, a sleek black car pulled up the driveway. Lila was trimming roses when she saw a tall, handsome man step out. His eyes were the same shade of green as the boy in the photographs. He extended his hand politely. I'm Andrew Grant. My grandfather lives here, I believe. Lila nodded slowly. Yes, he's inside. When Henry saw his grandson, something between joy and pain flashed across his face. You came, he said quietly. I heard you weren't doing well, Andrew replied. And I wanted to see for myself. Lila excused herself to give them privacy, but as she walked away, she heard Andrew's voice, low and uncertain. Grandfather, why did you disappear from us? Henry's answer was simple, but it broke her heart. Because I didn't trust love anymore. That night, Lila found Andrew sitting alone in the garden. He's changed, Andrew said. He used to talk about money, deals, and success. Now he talks about flowers and you. Lila blushed. He's just grateful I stayed. Andrew smiled faintly. You've done more than stay. You brought him back to life. And though neither of them knew it yet, that conversation was the quiet beginning of something neither expected. Love that would bloom where grief once lived. Autumn came softly to the Grant estate. The garden, once wild and tangled, now bloomed with color. Not just from roses, but from life returning where there had once been only silence. Henry spent more time outdoors now. He'd sit in his wheelchair beneath the oak tree, a blanket over his knees, watching the golden leaves drift down. Sometimes Lila would join him, reading aloud as he listened with closed eyes. Other times, he'd hum the tune he once played on the piano, lost in memory. But she noticed the way his hands trembled more each day. His voice grew weaker, his steps slower. One evening, as she tucked him into bed, he whispered, You've made this house feel like home again. You made it easy, she said gently. He smiled faintly. No, child. You made it possible. And for the first time, he reached out and took her hand. Promise me something, he said softly. When I'm gone, you'll keep helping people. Not for money, not for fame, but for the love of it. Lila's eyes filled with tears. You're not going anywhere. He smiled knowingly. Even the strongest roses eventually fall, my dear, but they always leave seeds behind. A few days later, Andrew found Lila in the library, sorting through old books. He watched her quietly for a moment before saying, He talks about you constantly, you know? She looked up, surprised. He does. Andrew nodded. He says you reminded him what kindness feels like, that you cared for the man, not the name. Her voice was soft. I didn't even know who he was when I came here. Andrew smiled. That's why he trusted you. He hesitated, then handed her a small sealed envelope. He asked me to give you this if anything ever happened. Lila frowned. Why give it now? Andrew sighed. Because he's in pain tonight, and I think he knows. She took the envelope but couldn't bring herself to open it. Not yet. That night, the storm returned, the same kind of rain that had first brought Lila to the mansion. She sat beside Henry's bed, holding his hand as the thunder rolled outside. His breathing was shallow, but peaceful. Lila, he whispered, I'm here. Do you remember? The first day you arrived? She smiled through tears. You told me to leave you alone. He chuckled weakly. And you didn't listen. Thank God for that. Tears slipped down her cheeks. You changed me, Mr. Grant. No, he said softly, his eyes glimmering. You saved me. His hand tightened around hers, just for a moment. Then it grew still. Outside, lightning split the sky, and inside, the old grandfather clock struck midnight. The man the world once called a billionaire had finally found peace. Not in wealth, but in love. Weeks passed in quiet mourning. The mansion felt different, emptier but not hollow. One morning, Andrew asked Lila to join him in the study. On the desk was a folder sealed with Henry's signature. Inside was a letter, the same one she had been too afraid to open. My dear Lila, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't grieve too long. Life has a way of planting new hope in unexpected hearts. You taught me that kindness is not a weakness, it's wealth in its purest form. I've left you something not as payment, but as trust. You will find the deed to a small foundation, the Morris Grant Foundation. It's yours to run, to help others find the light you brought into my life. And if, along the way, you find love, embrace it. Don't make my mistake of waiting too long. With eternal gratitude, Henry Grant. Tears blurred the words, but in her heart, Lila felt his presence. Not as a ghost, but as a quiet promise that goodness never dies. Andrew placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. He wanted us to do this together. She looked up at him, eyes shining. Together, he nodded. He said you're the only person he ever truly trusted. And as they stood there, the heir and the caregiver, something began to bloom between them. Not born of wealth or obligation, but of shared purpose and quiet affection. Outside, the roses in the garden swayed in the wind, the same ones that had once withered in silence. Now they were alive again. 3 years later, the old Grant mansion looked nothing like the lonely place Lila had first walked into. The broken windows had been repaired, the walls repainted, and laughter now drifted down its long halls. Children ran through the garden every weekend, orphans, patients, and families helped by the Morris Grant Foundation. Lila stood at the window, watching as volunteers handed out food and toys. She could almost hear Henry's dry voice beside her. If you're going to make a mess of my garden, at least make it worth it. She smiled. You'd be proud of this mess, Mr. Grant. A warm hand slipped into hers. Andrew stood beside her, now a partner not just in the foundation, but in life. He had inherited his grandfather's business empire but chose instead to grow the foundation. First anniversary of the foundation's launch, he said softly. We did it. Lila looked at him and smiled. He did it. We just carried the torch. Andrew squeezed her hand. He left us the tools, but you gave us the heart. They walked together into the garden, where a marble bench stood beneath the oak tree. Etched into it were the words, True wealth is measured by the hearts we touch. Henry Grant. A soft breeze carried the scent of roses, bright red and blooming, stronger each year. Lila sat down, closing her eyes. Do you think he can see all this? Andrew smiled faintly. If he can, he's probably complaining that the roses are crooked. She laughed through her tears. That sounds like him. A few of the children ran up, handing her handmade cards that said, Thank you, Miss Lila. As she hugged them, she felt the truth Henry had tried to teach her. That love, in its purest form, doesn't end when someone is gone. It lingers, it grows, and it blooms again in new hearts. Andrew knelt beside her and said quietly, You know, he was right about one more thing. She tilted her head. What's that? He smiled, eyes warm. That if we found love along the way, we should embrace it. Lila's breath caught as he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold ring, elegant, understated, perfect. I'm not asking you to build empires with me, Andrew said softly. Just a life. One filled with the kind of kindness that saved us both. Tears glimmered in her eyes as she nodded. Yes. As the children clapped and the sun set behind the mansion, the garden glowed with golden light. The same place where grief had once lived now became a garden of beginnings. Lila looked toward the horizon and whispered, We kept your promise, Mr. Grant, and we'll keep it for the rest of our lives. The wind stirred the roses, and for a moment, just a brief, gentle moment, It felt like the old man was smiling with them. The garden had fallen quiet after the laughter faded. The children had gone home, the lights from the mansion glowed softly in the dusk, and Lila and Andrew remained beneath the oak tree, the same tree that had witnessed so much pain, and now so much love. Andrew brushed a stray curl from Lila's face. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "what he'd say if he were here?" Lila smiled faintly. "He'd probably scold us for being sentimental." They both laughed. Then, as the wind rustled the branches above them, a single rose petal drifted down, landing right between their joined hands. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lila whispered, "Maybe that's his answer." 6 months later, the Morris Grant Foundation had grown beyond the mansion's walls. There were new centers across the city, helping the elderly, funding hospitals, and giving scholarships to underprivileged youth. And everywhere they went, there was a small golden plaque that read, "In memory of Henry Grant, who taught us that kindness is the greatest wealth." Lila often visited the garden on quiet evenings, sitting on the marble bench with a journal in her lap. One evening, she opened a drawer in Henry's old study, looking for foundation files, and found something she had never seen before, a leather-bound notebook. Inside, written in Henry's steady handwriting, were the words, "If anyone ever reads this, it means I was lucky enough to be loved again. The world taught me that money could buy everything but peace. Then she came and gave me both. I hope she never forgets how much her kindness changed an old fool like me." Lila pressed the notebook to her heart, tears blurring the ink. "Thank you," she whispered. She placed the book beside his photo on the desk, where the morning light would touch it every day. A year later, the Grant mansion had never seen such joy. The same halls that once echoed with silence were now filled with music, laughter, and roses, hundreds of roses. As Lila walked down the aisle on the garden path, she glanced toward the oak tree. A gentle breeze swept through the branches, and for a heartbeat, she swore she saw Henry standing there, smiling, proud, peaceful. When Andrew took her hand at the altar, he whispered, "He's here, isn't he?" Lila nodded, eyes glimmering. He never left. As they exchanged vows beneath the setting sun, the wind carried the scent of roses through the air, and the petals danced like confetti around them. The end. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and share to others. Also leave a comment to share your thought about the story.